May 18, 1958. Somewhere over the Banda Sea, between Sulawesi and the Maluku Islands, a BR-26 invader bomber is on a mission. The pilot's name is Alan Lawrence Pope. He is 29 years old. He is from PRRI, Florida. He flew 55 combat missions in Korea. He survived. He came home. He got bored. Somewhere along the way, he ended up on the payroll of a company called Civil Air Transport, a small aviation outfit based in Taiwan with an unusual client list. The client was the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. This is his 14th mission over Indonesia. He has bombed airfields. He has strafed ships. He has flown in the dark, without lights, with Indonesian rebel markings painted over the American insignia on his aircraft. As far as Alan Pope is concerned, he is fighting communism. That is the frame he has been given. Sukarno is going red. Indonesia is going to fall. Someone has to stop it. He does not know, or does not think about, the farmers below. The soldiers on both sides. The families whose sons are being drafted to fight their own countrymen. He is a professional. He flies the mission. At approximately 10 in the morning, an Indonesian Air Force PRRI-51 Mustang piloted by a young officer named Ignatius Dewanto is acquired on radar. Pope's B-26 is hit. He ejects over the Banda Sea. Indonesian sailors pull him from the water. And in his flight suit, in his actual flight suit, they find what no intelligence operative is ever supposed to be carrying. A United States military identification card. Signed orders from Clark Air Base in the Philippines, a U.S. military installation. Personal correspondence connecting him directly to the CIA. In Washington, it is still before dawn. CIA Director Alan Dulles is about to receive a phone call that will force him to end a secret war he was never supposed to be fighting. And in the jungle highlands of West Sumatra, a group of Indonesian colonels and economists who had been told, not in writing, not explicitly, but clearly, that the most powerful nation on earth was behind them, are about to discover what it means to be abandoned. This is not a story about communism versus democracy. This is not a story about loyal soldiers versus treasonous rebels. This is a story about what happens when the anger of real men with real grievances becomes the fuel for someone else's machine. And about the son, 8 years old in 1958, who grew up carrying his father's name through foreign schools and foreign cities, and who would one day sit in the presidential palace that his father had tried to overthrow. This is Chronicle Arcanum. And this is the rebellion the world was supposed to forget. Chapter 1. The Weight of Empty Pockets. Why the outer islands were already burning before anyone lit the match. Before we talk about the CIA, before we talk about rebel governments and Cold War chess pieces and American pilots with fake papers, we need to stand in a specific place. A military barracks in Bukit Tinggi, West Sumatra. 1956. The soldiers have not been paid in 3 months. Their boots are held together with wire. Their rifles are the same captured Dutch weapons they fought with during the revolution. The rice ration has been cut again, this time by a quarter. And this week, they read in the one newspaper that circulates through the barracks that Jakarta has approved funding for a grand new monument in the capital. A national symbol. A statement of pride. The soldiers look at the newspaper. Then they look at the trucks leaving the rubber plantation at the edge of town. Loaded. Always loaded. Heading to the port at Padang. The rubber comes from their land. The oil comes from their land. Sumatra produces more than half of Indonesia's entire petroleum output. The copra, the tobacco, the forest products, all from Sumatra. From Sulawesi. From the outer islands. The money goes to Jakarta. And from Jakarta, almost none of it comes back. This is where PRRI begins. Not in a smoke-filled room in Singapore. Not in a CIA briefing in Washington. Not in a politician's speech. It begins in the stomach of a soldier who has not eaten properly in a week, watching the wealth of his homeland leave on a truck that will never return. To understand why this resentment was so deep, you need to understand what Indonesia looked like in the mid-1950s. The country had won its independence in 1945, formally recognized by the Dutch only in 1949, after 4 years of brutal armed struggle. And the revolution had been fought everywhere. In Java, yes. But also in the highlands of Sumatra. In the forests of Sulawesi. In the rice paddies of Maluku. Men from every island had died for the idea of one free Indonesia. The promise of that idea was simple: independence from colonial exploitation. A nation where the wealth of the land went to the people of the land. Where every child had a school, every village had a clinic. Every soldier was paid. By 1956, that promise had curdled. Jakarta was growing fast. Sukarno was building. The capital had ministries, universities, and grand boulevards in the making. The bureaucracy was enormous and expensive. And the money to pay for all of it came almost entirely from the outer islands. The fiscal structure of Indonesia in the 1950s was brutally simple: the regions produced, and Jakarta consumed. Export revenues from rubber, oil, tin, and copra, collected in the regions, centralized in the capital. Development budgets allocated by Jakarta are spent mostly in Java. In 1957, economists estimated that Sumatra alone generated over 60% of Indonesia's foreign exchange earnings. It received approximately 15% of national development spending. The outer island commanders were not separatists at heart. Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed Husin in West Sumatra, 32 years old, a veteran of the revolution who had fought the Dutch as a teenager, had not spent his youth fighting for an independent Indonesia only to watch it become a new kind of colony. Java instead of Holland. Same formula. Lieutenant Colonel Ventia Sumul in North Sulawesi had the same fury. He commanded troops who had gone unpaid so long that some of them had started doing odd jobs in the villages just to feed their families. Military officers. Doing odd jobs. Colonel Maludin Simbalan in North Sumatra watched the same trucks go past. Watched the same empty schools. He had also watched Sukarno move steadily toward the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, which was concentrated in Java, which was growing in influence, and which Sumitro and many in the military believed was a catastrophic direction for the country. In his private notes from this period, later published in his memoirs, Sumitro wrote something that captures the entire psychology of the rebellion in a single sentence. We were not fighting to separate. We were fighting to be included. He had a wife. He had 4 children. The youngest was 8 years old. His name was Prabowo. Chapter 2. The Men and Their Dreams. Portraits of a rebellion that almost made sense. Before we condemn them or celebrate them, we need to meet them. Because the tragedy of PRRI and Permesta is not that they were wrong about everything. The tragedy is that they were right about some things and still lost. Syafruddin Prawiranegara, 60 years old in 1958. Former Prime Minister of the emergency government during the revolution. A man who had run the Indonesian government from the jungle when the Dutch captured Sukarno and Hatta in 1948 and had handed power back the moment the crisis passed, without hesitation, without demanding a reward. He was devout, incorruptible, and deeply alarmed by the direction Indonesia was heading. He had watched Sukarno flirt with the PKI. He had watched democratic institutions weaken. He had watched the outer islands bleed. He became the Prime Minister of the revolutionary government. He was not a man who did things lightly. Mohammed Natsir, former Prime Minister, the first to serve under the parliamentary system. A deeply respected Islamic scholar and politician who believed Indonesia's future lay in a genuinely federal, Islamically informed democracy. He joined the rebellion not because he wanted to destroy Indonesia, but because he feared that Sukarno's centralization was already doing that. Sumitro Djojohadikusumo, the architect, appointed Minister of Trade and Communications of the rebel government. He wrote the economic policy. He drafted the arguments for a federal system where each region retained meaningful control of its own revenue. He was calm, analytical. He wore suits. He believed, genuinely, that if the right argument was made clearly enough, the right outcome would follow. He was wrong about that. But he was not wrong about the underlying analysis. The military leaders, Husin, Sumul, Simbalan, men who had spent the best years of their lives fighting for this country's independence. Men who felt the betrayal of the promise not as an abstraction but as a physical reality in the empty mess halls, the unrepaired jeeps, the school their children attended that had no roof on the East Wing because the budget had run out. On the 15th of February 1958, in Bukit Tinggi, the highland city that had been the heart of Sumatran resistance against the Dutch, they made it official. They declared the Pemerintah Revolusionary Republik Indonesia, the revolutionary government of the Republic of Indonesia, PRRI. A few weeks later, Sumul's forces in Sulawesi formally declared Permesta, Perjuangan Rakyat Semesta, the Universal People's Struggle. As a sister movement, they formed a cabinet. They issued their own currency. They broadcast their own radio transmissions. They spoke of a federal Indonesia, a country where each island kept its own wealth and governed itself with dignity, sending to Jakarta only what was truly needed for national defense and foreign policy. For a few weeks, it felt almost plausible. They had territory. They had troops. They had internationally recognized intellectuals and politicians speaking for them. And, though they could not say it publicly, they had the quiet support of the most powerful intelligence service in the world. But every dream casts a shadow. And the shadows here fell on people who had no say in any of it. In Java, overnight, military wives found themselves married to rebels. Children arrived at school and heard their father's name spoken like curses. Families that had been split by posting, husband in Sumatra, wife in Jakarta with the children, as was common in the military, now found themselves on opposite sides of a civil conflict with no clear way across. Sumitro's family was among them. His wife and children were in Jakarta when the declaration came. The decision was made quickly, they had to leave. Singapore first, then Hong Kong, then Europe, moving through the expatriate circuits that existed for Indonesian exiles, living on savings, connections, and the goodwill of people who believed in the cause. Prabowo was 8 years old when his family began their years of displacement. He would not see Indonesia again as his home for a decade. These are not footnotes. These are the actual costs of the rebellion, counted not in kilometers of territory held or number of troops in the field, but in a child sitting in a foreign school, learning to write his own name in a language that was not his father's. The men who declared PRRI were sincere. The tragedy is that sincerity is not a military strategy. Chapter 3. The Shadow Players. What Washington saw, and what it decided to do about it. In 1957, Washington was terrified. Not of Indonesia specifically. Of the domino. The logic of American Cold War strategy in Asia was simple and unforgiving. China had fallen in 1949. Korea had been a bloody stalemate. Vietnam was already fragmenting. If Indonesia, the largest country in Southeast Asia, the 5th most populous nation on Earth, sitting on the Malacca Strait through which half the world's shipping passed, went communist, the entire region was lost. And Sukarno was not helping. He had visited Moscow. He had visited Beijing. He had met with Khrushchev and Mao and seemed to genuinely enjoy both conversations. He had accepted Soviet military equipment. He was pursuing a policy he called a non-alignment, which to Eisenhower and the CIA looked uncomfortably like playing both sides while leaning left. Most alarming, the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, was growing. By 1957, it had over 1 million members, making it the largest communist party outside China and the Soviet Union. It was legal. It was winning local elections. And Sukarno, rather than suppressing it, was incorporating it into his political framework. Inside the CIA, the assessment was stark: Indonesia needed a course correction. And if the internal reformers, the colonels, the economists, the federalists, were already pushing for one, that was an opportunity. The operation was given the code name HAIK. Its parameters were, by the standards of Cold War covert operations, substantial. CIA officers began making contact with rebel emissaries in Singapore and Manila, neutral ground, far from Jakarta's surveillance, in the hotel lobbies and private dining rooms that served as the informal embassies of the Cold War's shadow world. The initial conversations were careful, exploratory. Both sides are taking the measure of the other. Then the weapons began to arrive. Small arms first. Then heavier equipment, mortars, artillery pieces, communications gear. Delivered by air at night to jungle airstrips that had been cleared by rebel troops following maps provided by the agency. Money followed. Substantial sums, routed through the informal networks of the overseas Chinese business community that connected Singapore, Manila, and the outer islands, the same networks that had financed smuggling and trade for generations, now repurposed for intelligence funding. And then the pilots. This is where the operation crossed a line that it could not uncross. The CIA contracted pilots, Americans, Taiwanese, other nationalities, through civil air transport and other front companies to fly combat missions in support of the rebels. The aircraft were B-26 Invader bombers, painted with Indonesian rebel insignia, ostensibly belonging to the PRRI Air Force. In reality, they were CIA aircraft, flown by CIA contractors, operating out of U.S. military facilities in the Philippines. The legal and diplomatic exposure of this arrangement was enormous. If any of those pilots were captured with their actual documentation, the fiction of American non-involvement would collapse completely. Someone in Washington decided that was an acceptable risk. They were wrong. Alan Pope flew his 14th mission on May 18, 1958. He was targeting Indonesian military vessels near Ambon. It was the kind of mission he had flown a dozen times already, low altitude, fast run, in and out before the defense could respond. Except this time, an Indonesian Air Force Mustang was already waiting. Ignatius Dewanto, the Indonesian pilot who shot him down, was 26 years old. He had trained in the United States at the same kinds of air bases that Alan Pope had trained at. He was, in the abstract, exactly the kind of American-aligned military officer that Washington claimed it was trying to support. He did his job. He shot down the enemy aircraft. He did not know, and could not have known, that the man parachuting into the Banda Sea was an American working for the CIA. But he found out quickly. When Indonesian sailors pulled Pope from the water and searched him, the documentation they found was not the cover story he was supposed to be carrying. It was everything. His U.S. military ID, orders signed at Clark Air Base, personal letters, diary entries, documents that named names, described operations, established timelines. Pope was, by every measure, the worst prepared intelligence asset in the history of American covert operations. Or perhaps, and this is worth considering, he simply did not believe he would be shot down. He had flown 13 missions. Each one had been fine. The confidence of the veteran who has survived enough times to stop worrying about the possibility of not surviving. The reaction in Washington was immediate and brutal. Within hours of confirmation that Pope had been captured, CIA Director Alan Dulles was on the phone with Eisenhower. The decision was made, the operation was over. No more weapons drops. No more supply flights. No more pilots. No more money. The United States government, which had been, for months, the primary external support for the PRRI rebellion, simply stopped. The colonels and economists who had staked their futures on the assumption of American backing received no warning. No explanation. No apology. They received silence. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the triumphalist Cold War narratives, the ones about brave CIA officers fighting the spread of communism. The machine did not care about federalism. It did not care about the outer islands' legitimate economic grievances. It did not care about Shafruddin's integrity or Sumitro's economic analysis or the boots that had fallen apart in the Bukittinggi barracks. The machine cared about one thing, that Sukarno be weakened enough to be manageable. When that goal became impossible to pursue without embarrassment, the machine moved on and left the Indonesians, who it had used as fuel, to find their own way out of the fire. Chapter 4. Jakarta strikes. The speed and violence of a government fighting for its life. Sukarno's response to the rebellion was, by any measure, decisive. On February 21, 1958, 6 days after the PRRI declaration, he gave the rebels an ultimatum: surrender within 5 days or face military action. The rebels did not surrender. On March 12, Indonesian military forces launched a major offensive in Sumatra. The army that moved against PRRI was not the dispirited, underfunded force that the rebels had been counting on. It was the same army, but it had been preparing for exactly this moment for months. Abdul Haris Nasution, the army chief of staff, had quietly positioned troops and logistics. Sukarno had declared martial law in March 1957, over a year before the PRRI declaration, which had already given the military expanded powers. The rebel military strategy, such as it was, depended on two things: prolonged guerrilla resistance in the Sumatran highlands and continued American supply. After May 18th, one of those two things ceased to exist. The fall of PRRI's main positions was faster than almost anyone had predicted. Padang, the main coastal city of West Sumatra, a key rebel logistics hub, fell to government forces on April 17, 1958. Less than 2 months after the declaration. Bukit Tinggi, the highland city where PRRI had been declared, the symbolic heart of the rebellion, fell on May 5. In Sulawesi, Permesta held out longer, fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains that would drag on until the early 1960s. But it was a rearguard action. The rebellion's ability to project political or military power was effectively broken by the middle of 1958. The leaders scattered. Some surrendered and accepted the amnesty that Jakarta, pragmatically, offered to most lower-level participants. The government needed stability more than it needed martyrs. Some fled into the jungle and kept fighting, gradually fading into irrelevance. The senior civilian leaders went into exile. Shafruddin, Natsir, Sumitro Djojohadikusumo would not set foot in Indonesia for nearly a decade. He lived in Singapore, then Bangkok, then London, then various European capitals. He wrote. He lectured. He continued making the case for a federal Indonesia in forums where fewer and fewer people were interested in listening. His family moved with him, or followed him, through this long displacement. Prabowo grew up in this peripatetic exile. Singapore, Hong Kong, Zurich, London. He was a child of the diaspora, Indonesian by identity, rootless by circumstance. The child of a man who had been one of the country's most brilliant economists and was now a footnote in a rebellion that had failed. He attended multiple schools in multiple countries. He learned to be adaptable. He learned to read rooms. He carried the weight of his father's name, which in some circles was heroic and in others was treasonous, with a composure that those who knew him in those years remember as remarkable for a boy his age. The question of what that childhood did to Prabowo Subianto's political psychology is one that no one can answer with certainty. But it is not a question that can be ignored. The man who would become Indonesia's most powerful general, who would marry Suharto's daughter, who would be dismissed from the military amid accusations of human rights abuses, who would run for president 3 times and win on the 3rd, that man was shaped, in his most formative years, by the experience of being the son of a man the Indonesian state had declared an enemy. History does not repeat itself. But sometimes it puts the same family name on both sides of the same argument, 70 years apart. Meanwhile, in the outer islands, the ordinary people who had had no say in any of it paid the largest price. Villages that had been under PRRI or Permesta control faced investigation and suspicion. Families with rebel connections found employment and advancement blocked. The centralization that the rebellion had protested against intensified in its aftermath. Jakarta now had both the political justification and the military capacity to enforce its dominance more completely than before. The rebellion that had tried to stop the centralization of power ended up, paradoxically, accelerating it. The machine in Jakarta grew stronger precisely because someone had tried to break it. Chapter 5. Alan Pope's Second Life. What happened to the American, and what it tells us about the machine. Alan Pope was tried in Jakarta. The trial was a gift to Sukarno, concrete, visible, internationally reported proof that the United States had been secretly arming his enemies. The captured pilot, the embarrassing documentation, the confession of direct CIA involvement, it was everything a leader needed to justify his anti-Western rhetoric and strengthen his domestic position. Pope was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. Sukarno never carried out the sentence. He was keeping Pope as a chip, a diplomatic instrument, a marker to be cashed in at the right moment. That moment came in 1962. Indonesia was pressing its claim to West New Guinea, then still held by the Dutch. The Kennedy administration, eager to resolve the dispute and maintain some influence with Sukarno, was brokering negotiations. In this context, the quiet release of Alan Pope became part of the deal. Pope was released in July 1962. He flew home to Florida. He lived another 53 years. He died in 2015, at the age of 85. He was never charged with anything in the United States. He was not prosecuted. He was not publicly acknowledged as a CIA operative for decades. He gave occasional interviews. He seemed to carry what had happened with the equanimity of a man who had done what he was hired to do and gotten unlucky. The Indonesians who had believed in the operation he was part of did not have a diplomatic chip to play. The colonels went into the jungle or into prison. The economists went into exile. The ordinary soldiers who had thrown their lot in with the rebellion faced whatever Jakarta decided to do with them, which, to the government's credit, was usually amnesty rather than mass punishment. Sukarno needed the country to function. Purges are expensive. Amnesty is cheap and sometimes even popular. But amnesty does not restore what was lost. The years of service that were erased. The promotions that never came. The communities that had to spend a decade proving they were loyal Indonesians again. Alan Pope went home to Florida. They went home to suspicion. Chapter 6. The Dress Rehearsal. From PRRI to the Jakarta Method, how 1958 made 1965 possible. PRRI and Permesta failed. The CIA's covert operation was exposed, abandoned, and publicly denied. Sukarno emerged from the crisis stronger than before. The rebel threat had given him the political cover to accelerate his guided democracy project, further sidelining parliamentary opposition and consolidating power around himself, the military, and the PKI. In Washington, the conclusion drawn from the PRRI failure was not that covert intervention in Indonesian politics was wrong. The conclusion was that it had been done wrong. Too obvious. Too dependent on external actors. Too easy to expose when a single pilot was captured. The next intervention would work differently. Instead of supporting external rebels against the central government, the CIA would identify and cultivate the right people inside the existing military and political establishment. People who shared Washington's anti-communist objectives. People who were already inside the system. The strategy would not be to break Indonesia from the outside. It would be to wait for the right moment and be ready to support the right people when they moved. That moment came on September 30th, 1965. A group of left-leaning military officers, claiming to preempt a coup by right-wing generals, killed 6 senior army commanders in Jakarta. The events of that night remain, even today, among the most contested and murky in Indonesian history. What is not contested is what happened next. General Suharto, who had not been targeted by the killers, a fact that has generated decades of speculation, moved quickly and decisively. He declared the killings a communist coup attempt. He took control of the army. He moved against Sukarno, and then began what historians now call, with clinical understatement, the anti-communist purge of 1965 to 1966. The PKI, the party with over 3 million members, the party that Sukarno had included in his political coalition, the party that Washington had spent 15 years trying to destroy, was annihilated. The killing was systematic. It was coordinated. It used lists. Local military commanders were given the names of PKI members, sympathizers, and anyone suspected of leftist associations. Paramilitary groups, some of them with connections that can be traced, through the documents, back to years of contact with US intelligence, carried out the actual killing. The estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to 1 million people. In 3 months. Vincent Bevans, in his essential book The Jakarta Method, documents in meticulous detail what happened next. This template, the rapid, organized destruction of a communist or leftist political movement through mass extrajudicial killing, was subsequently studied, and in some cases directly assisted, by American intelligence in country after country. Brazil, 1964. Indonesia's experience was explicitly cited by US embassy officials as a model. Chile, 1973. The same architecture. The same lists. The same speed. Argentina, 1976. The same logic. The body count across these operations runs into the hundreds of thousands. This is why PRRI matters beyond Indonesia. Not because of what it was, but because of what came after it. The failure of 1958 taught the machine how to succeed in 1965. And the success of 1965 taught the machine how to operate in Brazil and Chile and Argentina and dozens of other places where governments inconvenient to Washington needed to be changed. PRRI was the draft. 1965 was the year the work was published. And the published work killed roughly 1 million people in Indonesia alone. Epilogue. The sun in the palace. What stays, and what gets lost? Go back to the beginning. The colonels believed they were fighting for justice. The civilians believed they were fighting for economic fairness. The CIA believed it was fighting the spread of communism. Sukarno believed he was fighting the disintegration of the nation he had spent his life building. All of them were partly right. All of them paid for it. The outer islands' grievances were real. They were never fully addressed by PRRI's defeat. In fact, the rebellion's failure made them harder to address, because any regional pushback could now be characterized as potential separatism. The structural imbalance between Java and the outer islands that fed the rebellion in 1958 would continue for decades, generating different crises at different moments, in Aceh, in Papua, in Maluku, each time carrying an echo of the same original complaint. Syafruddin Prawiranegara eventually reconciled with Jakarta. He lived until 1989. He is remembered, by those who remember him at all, as a man of integrity who made a catastrophic political miscalculation. Mohammed Natso also returned. He remained active in Islamic politics for the rest of his life. He died in 1993. Sumitro Djojohadikusumo returned to Indonesia in 1967, after Suharto had replaced Sukarno and the political landscape had completely changed. The new government, needing economic expertise, brought him back. He served as a minister again. He became one of the architects of Indonesia's economic development in the Suharto era. The irony is almost too large to process. The economist who had rebelled against Sukarno's government became a key technocrat in the government that replaced it. History is not always neat. His son Prabowo came home with him. He was 17. He had spent the formative years of his life outside the country his father had tried to reshape. He would spend the next several decades trying to find his place inside it. Military Academy. Special Forces. Rapid advancement through the ranks, aided partly by his father's rehabilitation and later, significantly, by his marriage to Suharto's daughter Titiek. He became one of the most powerful military figures in Indonesia. He was dismissed in 1998, the year Suharto fell, amid accusations of involvement in the kidnapping of student activists and other human rights violations. He denied the most serious charges. The truth of exactly what happened in those final months of the new order remains disputed. He ran for president in 2009. Lost. He ran again in 2014. Lost. He ran again in 2019. Lost and disputed the result. He ran in 2024. He won. Prabowo Subianto is now the President of the Republic of Indonesia. The son of the rebel economist who tried to break the Indonesian state sits in the presidential palace of the Indonesian state he tried to break. His father, who believed Indonesia needed a federal system where the outer islands kept their own wealth, lived to see his son become the most powerful figure in the centralized unitary state that crushed that dream. Sumitro died in 2001. He did not live to see his son win. History does not repeat itself exactly. But sometimes the arc is long enough that you can see the shape of it only if you stand far enough back. The machine that used the rebels' anger as fuel in 1958 was the same machine that refined its methods and deployed them again in 1965, this time far more effectively, and with consequences that lasted for a generation. The machine does not keep score on human lives. It does not remember the families it scattered. It does not record the names of the children who grew up in foreign schools carrying the weight of their father's choices. It only asks, did the outcome serve the objective? In 1958, no. In 1965, yes. And that is all the machine needs to know. In the next episode, we follow the machine to 1965, to the night that changed Indonesia forever, and to the method it exported to the world. This is Chronicle Arcanum. The past is not behind us. It is the architecture we are still living inside. Until we decide to read the blueprints.